Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Battle for the World. I'm Peter Apps, Reuters columnist, writer, historian, and several other things. And once again this week, I'm going to take you behind the headlines, this time when it comes to the risk of war in Europe. At the moment, I'm in Tampa, Florida, home to several US military headquarters, including US Central Command, currently fighting a war in the Middle East. But even here, in the almost year-long sunshine, there is talk of Europe, both the conflict already happening between Russia and Ukraine, as well as what might happen if that broadens to include the rest of NATO. Increasingly tied into that, of course, is the psychodrama of the second Trump administration, with growing rows with multiple European governments ahead of NATO's summit in Ankara, due to take place in July. Trump has described NATO as a paper tiger and told several foreign interviewers he is considering withdrawing from the alliance altogether, as well as a formal announcement of 5,000 troops being pulled from Germany and perhaps more to follow from Italy and beyond. As many of you know, 2 years ago I published Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO from the events that led up to its founding at the end of World War II to its 75th anniversary in 2024. That book, of course, included the first Trump administration. This footage is from a rather awkward 2018 breakfast with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Throughout Trump's first spell in office, there were plenty of questions whether NATO would survive, and of course it did. This footage shows the NATO-led battle group in Estonia conducting exercises in spring 2020 at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also during the Trump administration's final year in office. NATO activity across Eastern Europe ramped up even further from 2022 with the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, with NATO pulling together much more sophisticated war plans to defend the eastern part of the continent. That brings us to a paradox. As of 2026, in many respects, NATO is hugely more prepared for any war with Russia than it was a decade earlier. But as things stand, those plans are almost entirely dependent on the US and its military. The man in uniform on the left in this video is US Air Force General Alexis Grinkovich, NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and the man responsible for leading NATO forces if they ever go to war with Russia. Equally importantly, he is also the head of US European Command, the top commander of all US forces on the continent, answering directly to the President and Secretary of Defense, or the Secretary of War, as it's been since late 2025. That means that going back to the last years of World War II, the key military decisions that have shaped Western military strategy have been almost entirely US-led. In fact, even if you go back as far as World War I, no major conflict has been won on the European continent in well over a century without a large US commitment. For the first 2 years after Russia's full-scale 2022 invasion, it looked as though the same might be true for fighting in Ukraine. From last year, however, the Trump administration has dramatically pulled back what was initially quite hefty US support of weapons. Both before and since that invasion, successive US presidents have always made it clear that US forces would not fight for non-NATO members like Ukraine in the way they would for those in the alliance like the Baltic states. As well as repeated public statements, the US has always made that point through moving its troops through frontline areas as part of military exercises, including these tank drills in Lithuania in 2022. The US has kept doing that under Trump. This is a detachment of more than a dozen US M1A1 tanks deployed into Estonia in late 2025, part of a rotating presence that officials say is expected to remain in place until the end of the current administration. That US presence is important because if Russia ever moves to take any part of NATO territory, for example, the majority Russian-speaking town of Narva on the Estonia-Russia border, it ensures there are enough US troops not that far away to be caught up in the conflict from the start. In any war with Russia, those few hundred US troops in forward NATO positions would likely be significantly outnumbered by attacking Russian forces. But that's where the strength of combined US and wider NATO power elsewhere in Europe fast comes into play. The US alone almost always has several hundred combat aircraft based in Europe on standby not just for crises there, but also for the Middle East. European nations also have several hundred spread between them, an increasingly modern force that by the early 2030s will include several hundred European F-35 Joint Stealth Fighter attack jets. All this makes NATO much more than a paper tiger. And ever since NATO's military structures were set up in the early 1950s, its personnel from different nations have worked together to deliver command and control and fight together if they have to. The problem, though, is that has almost always been structured to rely on US systems. And in the event of a major conflict, the assumption has always been that they would fight under a US commander getting their orders from the White House. That assumption is only now being questioned. Ever since 1951, the top NATO Supreme Military Commander has been American, while the Secretary General, the top civilian official, currently former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, has been responsible for the diplomatic side of keeping the alliance together. For decades, indeed practically since NATO's foundation, US officials have been pushing European nations to do more, and in recent years they've started to be successful. Germany now has 5,000 troops in Lithuania, a full tank brigade, including German families, sending what is intended to be an unmistakable message that the Bundeswehr will fight if Russian troops move onto NATO soil. That's important because the so-called Suwałki Gap, the patch of Lithuanian and Polish territory between Russia's ally Belarus and the Kaliningrad enclave on the Baltic coast that's been highly militarized by Russia, is seen as one of the most vulnerable places on NATO's eastern flank. If Russian forces could take that ground, they could cut off supplies into the remainder of the Baltic states, with all the risks that brings for NATO. Those 5,000 German troops in Lithuania are just the start of what may be the most ambitious rearmament Europe has seen in modern times, with Germany vowing to build the largest army in Europe as it increases defence spending, and with its armaments factories already turning out more artillery shells in the current year than those of the United States. Even more ambitious, and enough to impress even Donald Trump, are Poland's preparations for a major conflict. The government in Warsaw is taking its already impressive professional army with its Soviet-era equipment and enlarging it to a full-scale national force while offering any Polish citizen who wants it more or less immediate military training, with more equipment on the way purchased from the US and South Korea. Poland, Estonia, and others are building up their own stocks and types of long-range strike missiles, such as these American-made HIMARS fired during America's Middle East Operation Epic Fury. And that, of course, is where the problems start to get extremely serious, because increasingly those weapons and the components to build them are in short supply. Already, Ukraine is presented as one solution to that problem. Ukrainian officials say they could almost double production of weaponry, particularly drones, if they had the funding. At the same time, some European officials increasingly describe the Ukrainian way of war, a mass mobilization army of almost independent brigades, each with their own high-tech cottage industry around them, might be a model for the rest of Europe. Those trained in US methods of highly organized command, control, communications, and other sophisticated techniques, however, view the way in which Ukraine has had to fight as extremely outdated. And therein lies even more problems. Even when European nations, their militaries, and their top commanders have learned to wage war in the way that Western states have chosen, they're almost always doing it on US systems and through US-dominated structures. And suddenly, no one knows for sure whether those will be there if the moment comes. US commanders in Europe, for their part, have an awkward path to walk. Here is Commander of US Land Forces in Europe, General Chris Donahue, briefing industrialists, journalists, and officials in July 2025 on America's high-tech strategy to defeat a much larger Russian attack on eastern NATO nations. And here is Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk at the end of April 2026, questioning if the US might be loyal at all to Europe in the years that come. He's not just talking about the remainder of the Trump presidency, but all those administrations that follow. So there you have it. The answer to the question of whether or not NATO is a paper tiger is that, no, there's more to it than that. But if it is an animal, no matter how powerful it might be, then both its skeleton and its nervous system are still mostly American. And the lesson of the last 2 years is that when things change fast in the global system, they can do so very quickly. So, the answer to the question, is NATO a paper tiger, is, of course, no, President Trump. There is more to it than that. But the problem is that if it is any kind of animal, no matter how powerful it might be, then both its skeleton and its nervous system are still mostly American. And we can't rely on that any longer. That is extremely dangerous because the lesson of the last 2 years is that when things change now in the global system, they can do so very quickly, and they often don't change back the other way afterwards. NATO in its current state is no longer fit for purpose, and this is not an easy environment for it to make the evolutions that it needs. There's lots we haven't discussed in this video. In others, I want to get into the defence of the Baltic states, Poland and the Nordics, as well as looking at Russian vulnerabilities in their own backyard of the Arctic. But for now, I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been Peter Apps. This is Battle for the World. Please like, subscribe, and see you in another video.